Hello, everyone. My name is Olivia with Redmond, and I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today. The topic of today's webcast is Back to Basics, a practical guide to following the NIST framework for ransomware risk management, sponsored by Semperis. Semperis is the pioneer of identity-driven cyber resilience for cross-cloud and hybrid environments. The company provides cyber preparedness, incident response, and disaster recovery solutions for enterprise directory services, the keys to the kingdom. Semperis' patented technology for Microsoft Active Directory protects over 40 million identities from cyber attacks, data breaches, and operational errors. But before we get started today, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping details. First and foremost, we will have a Q&A at the conclusion of today's presentation, so do take a moment to type your questions in the Q&A box. Of course, Semperis has provided some fabulous resources on the left-hand side of your screen today, so please take a moment to review those. Finally, today's webcast is being recorded, so be sure to keep an eye out for the link to the recording to rewatch or share it with a colleague. And with that, I'd love to introduce you to our speakers for today. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from Asad Ali, technologist at the Sales Group, as well as Gil Kirkpatrick, Chief Architect at Semperis and Microsoft MVP. So I know we are in for a great event. And with that, Gil, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Olivia. And Asad, thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Glad to be here.
So let's get started off with some statistics to sort of set the context. And you can imagine when it comes to ransomware, the story is not very encouraging. Today, you can expect a business suffering a ransomware attack every 11 seconds, which if you sort of try to wrap your head around that, it's mind-boggling. Mostly it's SMBs and state and local government agencies, which kind of makes sense because they tend to have relatively smaller, maybe less experienced IT and InfoSec staffs. So that's not so surprising, but it is surprising that healthcare, both small healthcare organizations like clinics and large healthcare organizations like big hospital systems, are also very large targets for ransomware. And those organizations often have sophisticated InfoSec teams. And I guess you could imagine that has to do with the fact that they really can't afford any downtime and are therefore sort of a fat target from a ransomware perspective. And the trend line is not good. I mean, if you go back to 2017 and look forward, it's pretty much a straight line increase as far as overall ransomware damages are concerned. And starting out in 2017 at roughly $5 billion to 2021, the estimate is around $20 to $21 billion in losses. That is a staggering amount of money that gets lost to ransomware and paying ransoms and in cyber insurance. So it's definitely not a pretty picture and sort of underscores why this is such an important topic today. Asad, why don't you talk a little bit about what a ransomware attack looks like and how it actually works?
Absolutely. I think it's good that we start with that, because then later in the webinar, as we talk about what the NIST recommendations are, this will put into context what is the scope of things that we are trying to address. So here what you see is what we call the attack lifecycle. So I'll start from the top left-hand side. So let's say you can have an entry into this attack scenario, which can come with the phishing attack, or maybe a spear phishing attack, which is a more targeted attack, because instead of sending out an email to mass audience, you may have a targeted email, in which case it's a bit harder to detect because you may see some personal information in it, in that spear phishing attack, which may lead you to believe that this is an actual email instead of an attack. And with that, once you click on that, I mean, you get this initial injection of this malware. This can happen through phishing, as we talked about. It can happen through some other mechanisms as well. So, for instance, I mean, you could have some supply chain injection, where your DevSecOps scenarios where you're building the software, it could be injected during that life cycle. But that's a bit rare. I mean, generally it starts with an active user. Once you have that, now you have this malware which is persisting in your system. And that persistence can be over time. It may just lie there dormant. At some point, it may basically call back to a central server, which you call the phone home capability, where it's trying to update itself because that malware may be out of date, and it realizes that, well, it needs a newer version of that. It will basically connect to a server that would allow it to get an updated version. And now you have a new malware, which is could be more potent, it could be more targeted, it could be more deadly. And at this point, you start this reconnaissance phase where the malware will basically have access to one particular account, but it wants to now move laterally. And to move laterally because now it wants to infect other systems in your environment. It may connect with other users that may have maybe higher privileges than what you have. And in doing so, it will basically create another network of trying to identify those cases. So this is where the distribution of the malware happens within your network. And once it is there and the targets have been identified, it can encrypt them. And you may say, okay, well, I already protect my data because I encrypt them myself. So, well, now you have double encryption on top of that. And the first encryption you can handle, but this additional layer of encryption, which the malware injects, you cannot handle. So regardless of it, I mean, encryption has its own benefits. It's very useful. It allows data to be not breached but not taken by others. But when it comes to malware, you have to have some other tools in your toolbox that you can deal with. And with that, once it is encrypted, you of course get the ransomware notice to basically have the payment made in order for your data to be released. And companies do that. I mean, companies see this day in, day out, and they give the money and get the data back in some cases. But what happens is that now the loss of reputation that you experience, that often is irreparable. I mean, at best you could say, okay, well, after a few years, maybe users will forget, but sometimes that doesn't happen. So in all cases, when you look at this attack life cycle, you need to be able to protect it at the very beginning. Because once it is out, then you may be able to get the data back, but not the reputation. And I think this is where the NIST recommendations is coming in, that you need to look at all of these different phases of how the attack happens and try to protect yourself.
So that takes us to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, and specifically we're going to talk about a NIST intermediate or internal report 8374 that specifically addresses ransomware. But I wanted to talk first about the NIST Cybersecurity Framework overall. It's a really useful way of looking at incident response and protection activities. It breaks up all your cybersecurity activities into 5 phases that follow the typical incident response pattern. So you start off by identifying all the assets, the potential threats, what resources you have to protect, what people might be involved. And then after that phase, you use that information to develop a protection plan. So you identify what safeguards you can put into place that will make an attack less likely or less damaging. Once you've got your protection in place, then you need monitoring capabilities to detect a potential attack. And the detection process could be anything from monitoring network traffic to monitoring endpoints to checking emails, but anything that would help identify an actual attack in progress so that you can then move on to the next phase, which is to respond. And responding means assessing what kind of attack it is, somehow limiting the damage, possibly by partitioning the network or kicking the bad actors off the network in some way. And then finally, once you've determined that you have stopped the attack, you then begin the recovery phase. So those are the 5 phases of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And it turns out that that's a pretty effective way to look at the ransomware problem itself. All of those phases are relevant to dealing with ransomware. And that's, in fact, what NIST IR 8374 is all about. So what I'd like to do now is put up a poll question, which is asking you about your experience with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and NIST guidance in general, and how that applies to your particular environment. So you should see the poll slide up there. Please go ahead and respond. Assad, what's been your experience with NIST guidance in general?
So in general, Gil, I think they are very well structured and well thought out guidances. I remember that in Identity Defined Security Alliance context, where both you and I actually work in their technical working groups, we had the opportunity to respond to their recommendations on zero trust architecture. Mm-hmm. So when NIST publishes those guidelines, I mean, it's of course done by their own team of security experts, but then they open it up to the public review as well, which they call the public review period. And anybody in the industry is free to comment on them, give them their recommendations. So I remember that in the IDSA context, I mean, we provided them about 50 or so different recommendations on what should be done on the zero trust architecture moving forward. Yeah. And then they take those into account and then build that into the guidelines. So I think the guidelines that we're looking at for the ransomware would have followed through the similar pattern.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. My experience is similar, that the NIST guidance, I think, is very solid, very comprehensive. Sometimes it takes a while for those documents to go through the review and update cycles. But you can see all the intermediate drafts of the documents as well. And I think that in itself is educational, because you can see early thoughts and then you can see the updates, and that helps you put some perspective around the whole thing. So let's take a look at the results here. So we've got 12% say we follow the NIST guidance religiously. That's interesting. I would have expected actually less, to tell you the truth. Mm-hmm. NIST strongly influences what we do, 32%. And NIST is a nice reference for us, 52%. I think that seems reasonable. I would put myself in that same boat, that it influences what we do, but it's not a religious text.
Yes, exactly.
And then 2.5% say we don't pay attention to NIST, and I wonder if that's because they've decided NIST is just doesn't fit what they're trying to do, or maybe they're not even aware of it.
Could be. But I think that, as you can see, I mean, about half of the audience use that as a nice reference, which I think is what I had in mind as well. So
yeah, and if you just add up those three top categories there, that's 90-some%, 98% use NIST in some way. Right. That's actually a pretty impressive percentage, I think.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, so NIST IR 8374. So the IR stands for internal report, I think, officially is what it stands for, but sometimes it's also a preliminary report that will eventually be fleshed out and get more review. NIST IR 8374 is essentially the application of the NIST CSF to the ransomware problem. And as I said earlier, it really makes sense, because the CSF is a very good framework for looking at cybersecurity activities. And the current draft of the report that's available online, I would say is a good first cut. There's certainly no silver bullet in there. There's nothing that will jump out and say, oh my God, this is what we need to do to protect ourselves from ransomware. In fact, what's really notable about it is that it's all basic security hygiene. It's stuff that everybody knows how to do, but not everybody does well. And so in some sense, this kind of reinforces the idea that when you're concerning yourself with cybersecurity efforts in your organization, you have to do the basics. I mean, if you can do the basics, that gets you a long, long way. So what we're going to do is go through the recommendations from this NIST IR as they've sort of pulled them out and organized them around the CSF. And we'll just go through each point and talk a little bit about how that works out in practice. So Assad, endpoint protection.
So endpoint protection, I think that's a very interesting angle to that, because whenever you talk about ransomware, when we're looking at the life cycle, I mean, we said that, okay, well, there's a phishing attack and then the user does something. At the same time, I mean, it starts with some device. So essentially, I mean, you could either be using your corporate computer, you could be using your personal device. And we'll talk more about that as we go along as to what's the recommended way, I mean, which kind of devices you should have. But whatever device it is, I mean, it has to be protected. And one way of doing that protection is to make sure that there's antivirus running on it. And in order to do that, you could say that, okay, well, shouldn't that be easy? I mean, shouldn't we just put antivirus on all the devices and make it run? And easier said than done, because for various reasons. I mean, some people may turn off the antivirus. I remember that back in the early days when Windows was slow in the sense that, I mean, the RAM was not as predominant. You had these hard disks which were optical, so they took a while for it, or mechanical. And antivirus was really slow. So I still remember that, I mean, talking to my kids at that time, and they would say, well, we had the McAfee, but I've turned it off because it was slowing down the PC. And so that's an excuse. And similarly, employees would have similar excuses of turning off and doing different things. But now with the advent of solid state hard disks and the preponderance of RAM, which is much bigger, I mean, those are a bit less. So yes, I mean, let's start with the endpoint protection. That, I mean, whatever device it is that you're using, you protect it, and antivirus is one example of that that we could have.
Yep.
And NIST has some good recommendations on that to make sure that is kept current.
Yep. Yeah, certainly. I think essentially all ransomware attacks come through the endpoints in some form or another. So it makes total sense that focusing on protecting those endpoints would be an appropriate way to protect yourself. The next one is patching, and almost every ransomware attack exploits known vulnerabilities that have patches available for them, but those patches may not have been applied. And there was a report last year by an organization called Digital Shadows that identified 260 vulnerabilities that were actively being used for ransomware attacks. This is just in the fourth quarter last year. So 260 vulnerabilities, all of which had patches available for them. And the reason that they were being used is because so many people hadn't patched them.
Right.
And that's remarkable, but also understandable, because patching the patching process in large IT orgs is often slow and has lots of review cycles and testing cycles associated with it, which means that patches might come out on one day, but the patches don't get applied for, say, another 90 days, or maybe it's during a patch window that the organization has.
Right.
And certainly the most critical patches to worry about are the ones on the, I'm assuming most people run Windows on the desktop and in their server infrastructure. Those are generally the most critical ones to worry about. And I'd say Microsoft has certainly improved the patching process so that at least you don't have to worry about upgrading to new features just because you're applying a security patch. They've segregated those code changes, I think, reasonably well.
And as an aside, I mean, do you think that the organizations would have that responsibility to make sure that, I mean, those are done in an automated way? Because you talked about, I mean, the lag between the patch coming out and the point where it is applied. What if that process were automated, just like we have in other settings?
On your home computer, exactly. I mean, certainly I just let my machine patch itself when it needs to, and that's been fine. I think, IT orgs struggle with that because of the risk of, having applications or workstations fail because of the patch. So they have these fairly rigorous cycles to make sure that the patches are well tested before they deploy them in their organization. And but that's the consequence, right? That's the downside of it. Okay, so let's take a look at this next recommendation that came out of the NIST report, network segmentation.
So I think this one is also as critical as the previous one that we talked about, because as soon as you talk about the corporate network, and we were talking about the difference between the personal machine that you can patch in the background without having to worry about that, and your corporate environment where patches are, of course, a little bit more sophisticated because they have to be tested out. So on the same lines, the network within an organization is really complex, and there are two ways to have it. You could have a very flat network where all access is granted at a very linear level, in which case it becomes really easy for attackers to move from one area of access to another. But if you want to be really secure, then you need to have a segmentation. That if you are in one area of the network, you don't get automatic access to another area of the network. And the number that we see over here, 13, that corresponds to the 13%. And in the Purple Knight analysis that was done, it was found that about 15% of large organizations have anonymous access to their AD enabled. So which means that there is no network segmentation when you have anonymous access that goes from one area of the network to another area of the network, and especially in an area of the network which hosts your Active Directory. So that certainly is something which is a recommendation from NIST, and I think it should be taken very seriously.
I know when I did some work for both the U.S. and Australia defense agencies and also a couple of intelligence agencies, they were heavily segmented to the point where it made using the networks inconvenient. You had to jump through hoops to be able to get from one segment to another. But that's a way of partitioning the network and keeping sensitive resources away from potential attackers, and I think it's pretty effective. So let's take a look at this. Actually, the next two items on our list have to do with making our IT systems more usable by our user communities. This first recommendation was restrict personal devices on the network. Now, clearly, this is a sensitive issue because everybody in the C-suite and all of management wants to bring their iPhone or iPad and plug it into the network and do their work while they're hanging out at the swimming pool, which is awesome, but it has risks associated with it, obviously. In some sense, and we've been able to accommodate that to a large degree. But in some sense, we've become victims of our own success as far as making our applications and networks more usable. Certainly, there are tools, like mobile device management tools and things that you can put into place to make your personal devices more secure before you grant them access to your network resources. I know at Semperis we're using Azure Active Directory and some level of mobile device management so that I can't actually access any of our corporate resources without having some sort of security software installed on the device and going through a multi-factor authentication ritual. And it's mildly annoying, but it works, and I'm comfortable, that provides a layer of security that's really important. Asad, go ahead.
No. I was just saying that this notion of what's easy and what's not easy. That's always interesting, because if you burden people too much, then they'll move away and they'll find an alternative.
Exactly. Yeah, they'll always find a way to work around it. But that takes us to the next one, which is avoiding non-approved applications.
Right. So on similar veins, because access comes from a device, but then eventually it has to go through software, because there's some application which is interacting with it in some capacity. So organizations, I mean, tend to either create whitelists, saying, okay, well, these are the applications that you are allowed to use, and anything else which is outside that is forbidden. They could also have blacklists where they could explicitly forbid the use of certain applications and then allow others. Regardless of which model you follow, I mean, always keep this into account that, I mean, make things easy for the users. I mean, not excruciatingly hard. So again, I mean, going back to the conversation that we were having earlier, that, okay, well, network could be segmented. And if you say, okay, well, if you segment the network too much, then it becomes really hard. And the same thing is for applications. I mean, if you make it too hard, people will find a way around. I'm sure you've seen the movie Jurassic Park. I mean, it came out a long time ago, and since then there have been quite a few updates to that. But I remember that if you remember the mathematician character in that, and Dr. Ian Malcolm, who was working on chaos theory, and there's one quote that he had which still sticks with me. It says that light finds a way.
Yep.
And similarly, I mean, your users will find a way if you make things really hard for them, because
right, and it's a balancing act. It's definitely a balancing act to try and make things usable.
Absolutely.
All right. The next thing on the NIST IR recommendations was educate your employees, and this is something I've participated in myself on occasion, but I'm probably not a great sample to use for judging the effectiveness of it. But certainly almost all ransomware attacks start with a phishing attack, and that means a user is looking at his email or looking at an SMS and then clicking on it or opening it or doing something with it. There's usually some sort of user interaction to get a ransomware attack started. So it makes sense that if you educate the users, that will improve your resistance to those sorts of attacks. And if there was a survey of IT InfoSec pros from, this was a couple of years ago, I think, and about 50–60% of them thought that educating their employees actually helped them out. On the other hand, phishing emails are getting really, really good. And even if you tell someone it's a phishing email and you tell them to find some indication in the email that it is a phishing email, it can be really, really hard. I know at Semperis we get get dozens of phishing emails a day probably, but we're also getting SMS messages that purport to be from the CEO and have a link for somebody to click to set up a meeting with them or something like that. And it's
right. Okay.
It's mind-boggling how sneaky these guys are and how good the phishing emails are.
Right, exactly. But I think in terms of training, you said, okay, I mean, have this training be given to the employees. But I think that this training has to be on a regular basis, because people tend to forget. I remember that, I mean, in Thales, of course, I mean, being a security company, we have this onboarding experience where people come in, and as part of the things that they do with HR, one of the things which they are required to go through is this the security awareness training.
Yep.
But having done that, I think unless you repeat it every 6 months, every year or so, people tend to get a bit complacent. Yep. And especially because these attack scenarios, they are getting more and more sophisticated. I mean, right now, I remember that, I mean, there are certain tools that are used where you could actually give scores to what the spam rating of a particular email is. And you have to identify whether that's a spam or not. And you could put that as a web service and then let people go on it, and then they could give themselves scores. So I think those tools would really help, so that instead of sitting in a conference room or instead of in front of a Zoom call and then listening to somebody present the slides, they can actually experiment and see where they failed and where they faltered, because that probably will stick a bit more.
I know it's quite popular for red team exercises to send spear phishing and phishing emails and see what the hit rate is. And that's, that seems like a good approach as well.
Good approach, yeah.
Yeah, right. To see where your education might be lacking.
Exactly.
So the next one is applying appropriate authorization controls. And I know, we'll talk a little bit about Active Directory later, but this is certainly a big issue there.
Absolutely. I think because whenever you talk about authorization controls, I mean, you have to say, okay, well, identify the identity of the user. You have to first see, okay, well, who is the user that is trying to connect? And you could do that through various ways. I mean, password is, of course, the simplistic way, but it has its own problems. So you could talk about, okay, well, if you're providing these controls, then what are the controls on setting the passwords? How frequently should they be changed? What should be the length of the password? What should be the complexity of those passwords? So those things come into play. You could also talk about MFA, that, okay, well, would multi-factor authentication be important? And there, too, you have to do that in a balancing act, because, as you said, if you put multi-factor authentication on every access, then that will not work. So you have to pick your battles and do it the right way. And then talk about the least privileges and, of course, the privilege escalation, things that we talked about. So the number that you see over here on the screen, 57, this corresponds to the average score for security, which is coming out in the Purple Knight scans. And that scan has been done over thousands and thousands of users and systems. And that's the average score, 57. And you may think that, okay, well, 57, it's above half, so it may be good. But in reality, no. I mean, it's a failing grade. Yep. So, and that is a clear indication that if the average grade is failing, which means that, well, we need to do something about our enterprise infrastructure and how those accounts are authorized and managed.
Yeah, and the Purple Knight report focuses primarily on Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, and I know, one of the features or downfalls of Active Directory is how complex you can make the authorization and delegation of access in the directory itself. And it can be astoundingly complicated, which means it will be difficult to understand and easy to configure in a way that exposes you to risk.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So this next one seems like it would be obvious: create an incident response recovery plan. And most organizations have some sort of IR plan or recovery plan. But it's often, what I've found is it's often not well suited to a ransomware attack. It's much more suited to the data center burned down, or somebody ran a backhoe over the fiber, or something along those lines that are much more constrained and sort of physically scoped. Ransomware attacks are interesting in that it can spread through the entire network, no matter how it's geographically distributed, in just seconds. And you're not starting from a place where you have some of your systems working and some of them not, and you need to sort of recover that capability. You're basically starting from scratch. And this is something that a lot of organizations, I think, haven't really thought through. Is how do you take a network that's been completely flattened? It may not have DNS. It'll have none of your Windows servers. You don't have the ability to log in. How do you go from that to a recovered IT environment? And that is a different kettle of fish than just bringing in racks of new servers to replace the ones that were destroyed by an asteroid or something. So it's really critical that people look at their recovery plans from using the lens of ransomware, where everything is gone. And when you look at it that way, then you start realizing that the recovery process is not just an IT exercise. You actually end up having to involve lots of different parts of the organization to bring things back effectively. So if you have a separate server management team, you certainly need them. If a lot of your servers are virtualized, or maybe your AD is virtualized, you'll have to bring the virtualization team in. Your Active Directory, which is what we tend to focus on at Semperis, because it's such a key piece to your security story. It integrates with your identity management system, maybe your HR system. You need to coordinate with those people. Possibly your networking team to set up an isolated network so you can do the initial recovery in an isolated environment because you're probably still undergoing an attack while you're trying to recover. Like I mentioned, DNS, you need to get your DNS team involved. And because it's such a wide scale problem to do this recovery, and if you're an organization of any size, you probably have to get your legal and HR people involved as well, because you'll have to make some sort of public statement, especially if you're a public company, you have to make some sort of public statement about what's going on. And then legal's also interested both from an insurance and a liability standpoint too. So they need to at least be aware of what the process is and when you actually start going through that recovery.
Yeah, exactly. I think those are the numerous moving pieces that all have to come together, and they have to come together almost concurrently or simultaneously in order for the system to be up and running again.
Yeah, and if you don't plan it and you don't practice it, it's not going to work. That is for sure.
Exactly. Yeah. It's not going to work.
So part of the recovery is backup and restore.
And on the backup and restore, again, as we were talking about a ransomware attack, which let's say has encrypted a section of your data, and we're talking about the fact that, okay, well, if it is encrypted, then you cannot decrypt it without knowing the keys, and having an extra layer of encryption before that doesn't help either. So it comes down to making sure that whatever data you had, it was backed up. Your system was backed up, whether it's an Active Directory that you're talking about, whether these are files on a server somewhere. If you're using Confluence, then that database needs to be backed up. So whatever is your the assets that you deal with, that you protect on a regular basis, they need to be backed up. And the question is, okay, well, backing up is just one part of it. Have you tested what is being backed up? Because just having a number show up somewhere saying, okay, yes, it was done, is just a check mark. But in reality, have you tried to restore from it and get the same data back? And it's surprising to see that, well, how few companies do that. You would think that, okay, well, if you back up, then you would test the restore as well. But again, based upon the numbers that we see, in 2019, for instance, 35% that you see right now, it's a number of companies that say that they have actually tested their backup and recovery system on a quarterly basis. So, okay, 35% is low. It should be higher. The only hope is that since this statistics is from 2019, maybe by now people have learned their lesson and they're actually doing more backup recovery testing than they were 2 years ago.
I'll tell you, I've been in this business for a long time, and I know for a fact that not testing backups is a righteous tradition in IT. Because even back in the late 70s, you'd have tape backups of your systems, and nobody ever tested them, right? And you lose a motherboard, you get the motherboard replaced, you hang the tape and try to restore the system, and oh my God, you can't read the tape anymore. So,
you can't read the tape anymore, exactly. And those were the days where sometimes, you would say that the hard disk is not reliable. I remember that, when I was working with Schlumberger a long time ago, we had the field engineers who would go out to the field, and basically they would do the logs, and the data would come up, and they would store it on their hard disk, on their VMS systems. And the first thing that they did after that was that they would put it on tape. So they had those 4mm tapes that they had, and they said, okay, well, we are putting it on the tape because the hard disk is not reliable.
Yep.
But the question was that did they go back and test those tapes? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm going to guess not. All right, so this is part of the recovery planning exercise. Really, is maintaining a list of internal and external contacts for incident response. I mentioned earlier that you will often have to involve several different groups to do an effective ransomware recovery. And so it seems obvious you keep that contact information around, but don't store it on a file share someplace, or don't rely on your global address list and Exchange or anything like that, because it's going to be gone. So it could be a printout that you keep in a safe location, or it might be a cloud system where you store your files. That would be fine too, provided you can actually access it without going through your on-prem AD for authentication. But you need to have that contact list in order to coordinate the whole recovery activity. And then this brings up what I think is the most notable thing in this NIST IR 8374, which everything we've talked about so far are basics, right? I mean, these are activities that everybody has heard, everybody practices to a greater or lesser extent. But this one surprised me, and I think it was a good thing to bring out, which was continuously monitor directory services and other primary user stores for indicators of compromise or active attack. And this sort of highlights the centrality of Active Directory in ransomware scenarios. In fact, any kind of cyber attack, in fact, because Active Directory, almost every cyber attack will go through the company's Active Directory, and roughly 90% of organizations are running Active Directory in some form or another. So it's the idea of monitoring your directory services for some sort of indicator of compromise or active attack makes a lot of sense. And I'm really pleased. Obviously, coming from a vendor that focuses on Active Directory, I'm pleased that they added this into it. I think it makes a lot of sense. So why is AD such a big deal in these attacks? Probably Assad, why don't you go ahead and cover that?
Yeah, I think so. I think from my perspective, Gil, I think when we talk about the open catalog, because we went through the scenarios of what an attack looks like, and we said well they get a foothold, and then after that they move laterally trying to identify the targets. Well, AD is your target. I mean, this is where the repository of the user information is, and your information about all the details. I mean, not only your profile picture, which could be very basic, but your access to various servers, and how people get access to those servers in terms of their credentials. So we see that, I mean, when we have those servers which are accessed through credentials, and those credentials are not only that they're weak passwords, they are non-existent passwords. So that makes it even more hard to fathom. And the number that we have over here was that, well, if you have 12,000, and you will wonder, well, what's 12,000? Well, this is what one scan revealed, which was the number of accounts without any password at all. And if you're looking at it that level, then certainly, I mean, you have some things to take care of, and make sure that you address those, because that kind of thing should not happen.
What? 12,000 accounts with no password. That's brilliant. I don't even know how that happens.
And it's not that they were weak passwords, I mean, without passwords at all. So weak password is something which is easy to crack, but if you have something without passwords, then, and again, it could be some misconfiguration where somebody didn't pay attention. And it's not that it was done intentionally, but just went under the radar.
Yeah. And that takes us to another feature of Active Directory, which is that it's a great way to identify privileged accounts. So most in organizations that use Active Directory, which is most of them, they control authorization to their applications and to AD itself through both group memberships in Active Directory and through access control lists in the directory. And by default, and really by design, those are all readable by even an anonymous login. So the idea of being able to collect all the authorization information for the organization in one place and then deduce from that where the privileged accounts are. They might not be a domain administrator, but they might be an administrator over an OU, or might be an administrator over a set of machines that are running critical applications, which also have entries in Active Directory that will tell you what kind of applications they might be running. So that's another reason why Active Directory is such a critical component to monitor and to make sure it is not misconfigured.
Exactly. I think that misconfiguration is one thing which is done more often than it should, and maybe we can talk about the reasons for why that happens. I mean, when you talk about misconfiguration.
Well, you know, Active Directory was designed in the late 1990s, where I think the mindset of most software and security people was that the more options you have, the better.
The better, exactly.
Yeah. So every knob and dial you can imagine is exposed in AD to configure access rights and authentication and system configuration and all of that.
Right.
And I think that's that complexity really feeds into why it's often misconfigured.
Right. And there are various venues for misconfiguration. I mean, there's this complexity, which adds into it. And then the fact that, well, there are so many things that the administrator would have to do. And if one or two of them are misconfigured, then that's what the attackers really need. So you could talk about administrative privileges. I mean, you need to have as few of them as possible, but slowly they creep into your environment. You could have passwords, which are, let's say, either in plain text, as we just saw in that number before, or they're weak, which means that they're very easy to crack, or they're reused. In which case, I mean, it may be a very complex password, but if you find that out and you know that it is being reused in so many other places, then you have automatic access to those places. You also have some misconfiguration for maybe some legacy systems, which have been in use, and you could say that, okay, well, some engineering team requested that, saying that, okay, well, they need this feature which cannot be taken down, and this server cannot be updated because it's a very mission-critical application, and they get a waiver for 6 months. That 6 months turns into a year, and then maybe after 10 years, they are still using a Windows 2000 server, right? So those kind of things we live through the enterprise world. And on the surface, they look very innocuous and harmless. It's just one more thing. But I think when you take it in the context of security and ransomware, then even a small pitfall can be really, really huge.
Well, I know one of the things that's turned up in our Purple Night surveys quite frequently are service accounts, which have weak passwords and are never changed. Mm-hmm. And so that, you know, it gives you a long time as an attacker to actually figure out what that password might be. And then and along with that is delegation configuration, which is tricky to configure properly and easy to exploit if it's not. Exactly. So the next area of AD that's interesting to look at is group policy. And a group policy is a way of using Active Directory to configure your servers and workstations. And it basically exposes all of the configuration capabilities on those machines to the group policy engine itself. And one of the way that it works is part of the way that group policy works is that it propagates its settings through the distributed file service that Windows has built in called DFSR. DFSR? Distributed File System Replication. Yes. And that, as it turns out, is something that attackers have found is a really convenient way to distribute malware across the network. If you can get access to the file system on a domain controller and drop your exploitation tools into sysvol, you can have it distributed across the network so it's available everywhere to every workstation that tries to log in. And that's a really quick way to propagate your malware across the environment and establish complete persistence. I mean, there's essentially no way to get out of that kind of situation without a full recovery from scratch. Mm-hmm. Next one is the ability to recover AD from backup is often lacking.
And you would wonder why, right? Because and I think the reason for that is because, again, we were talking about the complexity of things, and this is yet another example of you make things complex and they will not work. And in this particular case, the number that you see in that box 28, I mean, this is certainly not today's date because we would be off by 13 days. This is the number of steps which are needed to do your Microsoft AD backup. And this is from their manual. And these are meticulous, multi-threaded steps which have to be done manually in order for you to make sure that the recovery is done properly. So when things are this complex, certainly it will not happen, because even with best of intentions, you will certainly not do a few of the things which are required in that, let's say, 28-step process, and in the end, you will not have a full recovery.
Yeah, I used to run a workshop for doing Active Directory recovery from, full force recovery from backup. And even in a very small lab system with every command typed out and specified, only about 30% of the people were able to successfully recover their AD from a backup. And it's not sufficient just to snapshot your domain controllers. You actually have to use a backup and restore. And you have to also be aware that in a ransomware scenario, it's quite likely that your backups themselves have been infected.
Exactly.
And you really need to look at provisioning brand new servers from original Windows install images and recovering your software on top of that. And that's quite an effort as well.
Exactly, because you never know. How deep the ransomware has gone. How deep the infiltration is. Do you stop at the application level? Do you stop at the OS level? And you may have to basically rebuild the entire thing. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. So one of the things, as we mentioned earlier, that this report kind of spells out is you need to do the basics. So when it comes to protecting Active Directory, we provide a tool called Purple Knight. We've mentioned it a couple of times, that you can get for free, that will do a full scan of your Active Directory and do, I don't know, it's got 80 or 90 different indicators of exposure and indicators of compromise that it can check for. And it gives you this awesome report card at the end that tells you how well you scored overall, and then also gives you specifics on how to mitigate the issues that it turned up. And the 68% here is the average Purple Knight score, which is in our grading system an F. So on average, across a few thousand of these tests, most people are failing.
You guys are tough graders, Gil.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So what I'd like to do is put up a poll here that says, how confident are you that your Active Directory security is aligned with the NIST recommendations, both ones we've talked about today and other NIST guidance. So go ahead and put your response in here. I know in my experience, primarily on the backup and recovery side, is that even large organizations with fairly sophisticated InfoSec teams either have an Active Directory recovery plan in place but have never tested it, or they have a plan that's written but no confidence that it would actually work in real life. It's rare, like less than 10%, that I've run into an organization that says, yeah, we have our Active Directory recovery process.
And then one other thing which makes it even more complex is that, sometimes you have multiple Active Directories. You may not have a single source. And that happens, in very large corporations, especially after some mergers and acquisition activity, where you could have employees coming from different parts, and they tend to coexist for a while. And for a certain duration, you may have multiple accounts in different environments.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, and it just makes the whole process that much more complicated, because you have to do it potentially have to do it several times.
Several times, right.
Okay, so our poll results here. Very few extremely confident. That doesn't surprise me. Somewhat confident and not very confident. That's the middle of the bell curve. Not surprising. Nowhere close, 12%. And then I don't even know. Hopefully that's because you're not exposed to that end of the organization, but maybe it's because things are so out of control you have no clue. I don't know. But these responses look to be pretty much in line with what I've seen in the past.
Yep.
And indicate indicates there's work to be done to make our environments more secure.
Mm-hmm.
So that sort of wraps up our presentation. I wanted to cover a couple of things. First, at Semperis, we're very much focused on the security of your identity systems, which today is primarily Active Directory for most organizations, but also includes cloud-based identity systems like Azure Active Directory. The Purple Knight tool, which we've mentioned, is something you can download for free. It will run a set of security scans on your Active Directory. It doesn't even require a privileged account. It can do it from, in fact, in some ways, it kind of acts like an attacker might who's trying to do reconnaissance on your Active Directory. And it gives you a really nice report card as to how well your Active Directory is configured, where the weaknesses are, and it gives you very detailed feedback as to how you can mitigate some of those configuration problems. And we have another product called Directory Services Protector, DSP, which is comprehensive threat monitoring for your hybrid AD and Azure AD infrastructure. It, along with tracking all of the changes in your Active Directory and assessing whether those might be malicious, it also uses the same basic technology in Purple Knight to continuously monitor your Active Directory for any configuration changes that might be a problem. And for those changes that do occur in Active Directory, it can even automatically revert them to a better state. So to wrap this up, before we take some questions, as far as recovering Active Directory is concerned, which is sort of where we focus the latter part of this talk, the guidance that you get from Microsoft is complicated. You need to consider the fact that in a ransomware or malware recovery scenario that your backups themselves are corrupted, which means that you need to go through a two-step process where you recover a fresh operating system and then recover your applications and data on top of that. Okay, let's take a look at our Q&A here and see how we are doing for questions. Okay, so first question. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go for it. No apologies.
Okay, great. It says, when people run the Purple Knight tool, what is the most common area where they are deficient? I think that the most common area is account security and Kerberos configuration. And I think, I'm not quite sure, Kerberos is something that a lot of IT people still struggle to get their heads around, especially the different delegation configurations that you can set up in Kerberos. But the average score in the account security section is 43%, which is a low F, which is pretty poor. And we see that come up quite frequently in the Purple Knight analysis. There's another one, which is, which NIST recommendations do you think give the biggest bang for the buck and why? Oh, that's an interesting one. Assad, what do you think?
I agree that is an interesting one because it has two parts to it, the which and the why. So I would say that maybe the minimization or avoidance of non-approved applications. Mm-hmm. That I would really highlight, and for a reason that I think that's a simpler one to implement compared to the rest of the additional things that you could do. Network segmentation, we talked about, it's very hard. You could do your employee training, that though necessary, but it still takes time. But if you're talking about the bang for the buck, then I would put controlling the applications which have access high, because that would make sure that you stop the attacks from happening at the point of entry.
Yep. I think for me, I would look at, I would have to say either sort of authentication, multi-factor authentication, that sort of thing, or maybe patching. I'm still surprised at the number of organizations that are so far behind on their patching that they're leaving their internal networks open to modern day attacks. I think if you can develop a scheme in your organization where you get patches applied right away, that would maybe be the biggest bang for your buck in my viewpoint. Okay, that seems to be it for questions, and we're just about at the end of time here, so I guess we will wrap it up. Assad, thank you very much for joining me today. It was a lot of fun, and I want to give a shout out to the work we've done at the Identity Defined Security Alliance, IDSA.
Yep. Thank you, Gil.
And I guess we can, Olivia, we can wrap it up here.
Yes, thank you so much, both of you. That was an incredible presentation, and we really appreciate you taking the time to share your insight with us this afternoon. And big thanks to Semperis for sponsoring today's event. We really appreciate the opportunity to be able to chat with you both. And thank you all for the rest of, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.